Sometimes you wonder, what would I do if I had a time machine available to me? Obviously, you would go back in time and buy sample libraries. Hi and welcome to my channel. I'm D.I.D. Choi, and today we're going to be talking about if I were to go back in time, if I were to start from scratch, what orchestral libraries would I buy? So before you buy an orchestral library, there's a couple considerations you need to make. From experience, I've realized that sometimes you buy a library or look at a library that has a lot of different features. Maybe it has a lot of articulations, maybe it has divisi, maybe it has really good ensemble patches or whatever. Then you realize that once you have it with your other libraries, it doesn't really fit in. Maybe it's too dry, maybe it's too wet. So these are some considerations you got to make when you're buying libraries. And especially if you're starting out, in my opinion, you should kind of decide on how wet your libraries are going to be. Some people go with a completely dry approach with stuff like VSL, sample modeling stuff, audio modeling, Spitfire Studio series, other studio instruments. And some people go really wet. Something that comes into mind might be Spitfire's Air Studio stuff, the symphonic series. In my experience, whatever wetness you choose, it's best to stick with it. And all your libraries should kind of match in that kind of atmosphere. Because if you have a really wet library and you're trying to mix it in with a really dry library, even if you're the best mixers, it just won't feel quite right. At least for me, in my experience. Another thing you should be considering are the numbers of articulations, what kind of features it has, how playable it is. This is kind of the most important thing for me personally. And then also, pretty obviously, the tone. If you have a really good playing instrument that sounds really bad, then who cares? It's just a synthesizer then, right? Now there's two kind of big streams of virtual orchestration that you might want to consider before you start. Am I going to take the traditional orchestration route where I have flute 1, flute 2, oboe 1, oboe 2? It's not ensemble patches, it's all solo instruments that I build up, and I program everything in the way an orchestra would be programmed. And then the other method is the kind of more modern cinematic style where you have a bunch of ensemble patches as well as a couple solo instruments, and you kind of build these huge sounding cinematic pieces. Now, neither is wrong or right, but for me personally, coming from a more classical and traditional orchestration kind of background, I prefer to use the kind of solo instruments, and that's what I'm going to be talking about mostly today. Now, within the traditional instruments, I would recommend, again, two streams. The first stream is to start with a kind of all-in-one library that is pretty good. It's not bad. It's not perfect either. You might be missing a few things. So once you get that all-in-one library, maybe you start picking up other things to kind of supplement the missing parts. So I would probably recommend BBC-SO by Spitfire. The core version is probably fine since you're going for the budget option. And you only get one mic position, but it's a well-mixed mic position, and you probably don't need much more of it. And then you might be missing a few things, like in the past, BBC-SO was missing muted brass, so you might go for a muted brass library, or just a brass library with muted brass in it. Now they've added that in, but there's still a couple missing things. So I think the woodwinds are a little weak, especially the clarinets, but maybe it's because I'm a clarinet player and I'm a little biased. And unless you go for the pro version, you might be missing some low brass and some auxiliary and the string leaders, so solo strings. Now the other method that I personally use, because again, I'm more of a traditional kind of guy using notation software often, I started with Note Performer, which sounds fine for demos, and it gets you really, really fast results. Like literally you just plug in the music and it plays it really well and fairly expressively. Like, if you had to do a quick turnaround thing, Note Performer can get you there. It's not like professional, obviously, but you get a really good idea of what the orchestration will be sounding like. So that's another option. If you want to spend a little bit more money for a complete orchestra, then something like, if you're a student, getting the Cinesample Symphony, or just like parts of it, because they give a 50% discount. And that might be pretty helpful. But apart from BBC-SO and maybe getting a discounted version of Cinesample stuff, I can't really think of that many things that will give you a good traditional setup that sounds really good. I know some of you are using the East West Composer subscription thing, and they're good to get you started. If I was starting again, maybe I would use that. But I don't find really any of the sounds satisfying enough for me personally. You either need to program the hell out of it, or it just kind of sounds flat. And there's also the terrible play interface, I think, right? The second option would be to go hard or go home. You go for the best libraries you can, one at a time as you save up money, and you kind of make do during that time with stock sounds. So maybe you're using Logic sounds, which are, fairly decent. They can get you by. Or maybe you're using, again, something like Note Performer, where you're importing in the sounds. Whatever it is, this is the route that I wish I had gone by, because a lot of the time I was buying fairly decent libraries that weren't like the top libraries that I wanted, but they weren't like bad either. So I kind of got the mediocre one. And then now I'm finding that once I save up enough money to get the even better one, now this mediocre library is just kind of sitting there doing nothing. So my idealized setup would be, for woodwinds, Berlin Woodwinds by Orchestral Tools. For brass, I can't really choose, but out of three things, either Cinematic Studio Brass, Cinebrass, Core and Pro probably, or Junkie XL Brass. For percussion, I would probably go with Cineperc. For strings, I would use CSS. And that would kind of be my basic template. And then on top of that, as you need kind of auxiliary instruments, you can add on to that. You can add things like the Berlin Soloist, expansion A, B, C, one or two of those. Now for the brass, because I chose three libraries, and I can't really choose which one to get, if you wanted something more, I would probably get another one of those three, or even all three of them, if possible. Now, if you still need something more, like maybe you need a certain instrument that none of the libraries have, or you kind of want a different workflow that you want to try, maybe getting Infinite Brass by Aaron Venture might be an interesting solution, because there's no key switching, it's very playable, but for me the tone of the instruments was a little subpar compared to the traditionally sampled instruments. Percussion is a library where you really don't need the best, because a lot of it is just single shots, and those are really easy to sample, right? All you have to do is just hit the thing, record it, there's your sample, right? Whereas when you're programming in legatos, you gotta have the long note, you gotta record the transition for each different interval, you gotta weave them together in the programming, and it's like a huge headache. Percussion is fairly easy, so for the longest time, I just stuck with the Logic stock sounds. I didn't really feel the need to buy a percussion library, because it was either I use the stock sounds, or I can go on something like freesounds.org. I think that's what it is. And you can download a bunch of percussion samples. So if you need a suspended cymbal swell, you can just download that and time it and just plop it into your piece. Add a bit of reverb and you're done. And on top of that, if you already have something like Cineperc, then you're pretty much set, because they have all kinds of different instruments. And if you need something more processed, learn how to process that instrument, right? I mean, it might be nice to have dedicated Epic Tom, libraries, but if you can make them yourself with what you have, I think that's probably better for you in the long run. And then if you have extra money, you can obviously buy them later. Another option is there's a bunch of free for Contact. There's the full version of Contact, but they're free if you have the full version of Contact. So you can get those things. Obviously, a lot of people will need a piano library. Of course, stock ones will get you by for a while, but getting something like maybe the Native Instruments Grandeur or Keyscape, which is a little more pricey. And there's a lot of good piano libraries out there already as well. If you check out stuff like Piano Book, there's a lot of free ones there. And for strings, everyone will need a solo string library at some point, probably too. I'll probably get Tina Guo Cello from Cinesamples, because it's probably one of the most expressive libraries I've ever played before, and I just love it, and it's great for layering with your cellos. On top of that, you can get Joshua Bell Solo Violin. I don't have it, but it's supposed to be the best, and it's really deeply sampled, and it's very playable, I hear as well. And then I would also maybe go for Spitfire's chamber strings. because it's a smaller ensemble, so you can use it for divisi kind of stuff, you can use it for layering, and there's also a huge array of different extended techniques and articulations that CSS doesn't have. So if you go with the BBCSO option, I might start out with BBCSO Core, and then I would get something like Tina Guo and Joshua Bell to kind of supplement my solo string leader kind of layering needs. And then I find that the woodwinds are kind of lacking, so if I save up, I would get Berlin Woodwinds again, the best library that I've ever played. Review coming soon, or maybe it's already up. I don't know what order I'm uploading these in. But yeah, and then Spitfire chamber strings, again, to kind of layer with your BBCSO strings, also do some divisi kind of stuff, extended techniques. It's just a really versatile library. You haven't subscribed yet? I won't give you the summary until you do. Just kidding. So in the end, it's all personal preference. I gave what I wish I had gotten, judging by the libraries I have today, wishing that I had taken a more direct route of getting to where I want to be, rather than kind of stopping along the way and buying those libraries that were good for now, or they're just really well marketed libraries that I kind of regret getting now. See that video up there. But everyone's different, so there's no really right or wrong answer. I didn't really talk about the dry library approach because I don't have that many dry libraries in my template, but also oftentimes with that kind of approach you would have to get a fairly expensive good reverb to put everything into a space and get that really traditional orchestral concert hall sound. I also didn't talk about a more cinematic type of template, where I might have suggested something like Audio Imperia Nucleus as a kind of good starter library where it has a lot of really good stuff, ensemble patches, hybrid stuff, cinematic stuff, as well as some nice solo patches. Maybe I can do another cinematic template library wish list later on. And while I'm shooting for a natural and easy to use setup, the most important thing is having a well-written piece with good orchestration. Of course, samples will never compare to a real orchestra, but you can use them to learn to write for one and get your pieces played. I hope you enjoyed the video. I'm really curious to hear what your ideal setups would be. Let me know down in the comments, and while you're down there, subscribe and leave a like. This has been D.I.D. Choi, and I'll see you in the next one.